So, when we're talking about vocabulary, it's actually everything that we do is has a vocabulary to it. And all children that are in an early years environment, they're in the sensitive period for language acquisition. But what we say matters, especially in a bilingual environment. If you are in a bilingual environment or you are a teacher who is bilingual, but you're teaching in only one language, understanding the words that you're going to be using and selecting them intentionally will be very helpful in having an effective activity that can be engaging to the children. Being sure that you are introducing new vocabulary that has an explanation. If you are reinforcing vocabulary, using that vocabulary with a shorter explanation. If this is known vocabulary, then being mindful that you are reinforcing the use of the vocabulary through this particular activity. Going back to the balancing and hoop activity that I talked about at the very, very beginning of this presentation, is that there was a lot of vocabulary in there because there was a lot of domains, and we were talking about colors, and we were talking about shapes, and we were talking about balance and right and left. All of those, the right and left is a concept, but it's also vocabulary. So having an awareness of what we're saying and how we're saying it will be very helpful in having a activity that is effective and rather easy to follow. And sometimes we want to isolate particular vocabulary that children may not be understanding. This could be a vocabulary lesson on prepositions, but the activity that you're doing is going to be a stuffed animal and a box, but the vocabulary could be prepositions of under, on, next to. So that could be the key vocabulary, and the activity is actually a vocabulary lesson. That's the learning intention. The learning intention isn't the mouse in the box. The learning intention is the vocabulary. So sometimes these two things go hand in hand, and you might have your vocabulary defined before, but after you go through your activity, you might see that some of the vocabulary may need different representation and may need more support. Or you might find that you want to change some of the vocabulary in the way that you have the activity plan listed. So let's look at some other whys, and very specific whys, that for creating an intentional practice around key vocabulary. Okay, so the why, here we go. The language level of the child and the children. So if you're talking about the vocabulary, it's understanding where they are. If these are the language, a second language for these individual children, your vocabulary might be different. You might have intentional vocabulary. Where are these children are? It's not necessarily based on age. This could actually be on the language acquisition. If you're teaching ESL, you may have a different vocabulary because these children already have a primary language and you're trying to link that to a second language. So understanding it's not the age, it's the language level of the child or children. In early years education, all activities are language activities because they are in the sensitive period for acquiring all of this language. And defining and perhaps even highlighting, are there new words that you are going to be presenting, and how are you going to represent them in the physical world? Having physical representation, as we know, is best practice when creating intentional activities for children. Okay, so now we have some examples. Language is everywhere, and it's how we process our experiences. So providing language and consistent language and repetitive language around activities. It's a fine balance between repetitive language and not giving enough vocabulary growth. So in the infant activity, it was very simple language, but it was also larger language than they would be hearing in everyday conversation. So it was very intentional on the part of the practitioner that they will narrate the descriptions of the movements that are happening. This is a drum beat from Africa. It sounds like footsteps. This harp sounds like rain falling. And so even though infants don't necessarily have the cognitive understanding of what rain sounds like, they are acquiring that language. They're being exposed to those words. And the more that this is repeated, the more that they will be able to meet those links. So this was a very intentional way of introducing the sounds of nature with the sounds of instruments. So the ones that are not necessarily as effective. So back to that yoga exercise, is that this is where she included her script for the narration of the yoga postures. This part of the language section could have just been tree pose, bear pose, but if she wanted to identify left and right, then that would be in there. There's a lot of words here that are the focus for the key vocabulary. It's key vocabulary, not all the vocabulary. And then the last one, which really isn't clearly defined and doesn't give us a lot of information, is happy and sad. When we looked back at this activity plan, there were a lot more words and emotion cards that she had listed, but her key vocabulary was only happy and sad. That really doesn't seem to coincide with the rest of the activity plan or with the age group that she had stated that this activity was for. So remember, it's not only the age, it is also the language level of the individual children. Whew, we've gone through a lot, right? Like there's just been so many steps that go into this. And the more that you write these, the more practiced you will become and the more intentional your teaching will become. Sometimes I've actually done an activity and then gone back and written the activity plan after the fact so that I can recreate it, because sometimes these intentional teaching moments come on rather spontaneously and you're grasping and you're pulling other things in. If you find yourself in that moment and you're like, wow, that went really well, that was really great, write it out so that you can be prepared to recreate this, or you can share it with a practitioner that might be less experienced than you. I still get amazing ideas from reading activity plans that I use. The one that on the yoga, I thought that was so great. And I've actually used that and shared it with other practitioners when talking about how can we transition children from nap, is I was able to share this activity plan and they were able to follow it pretty easily because it was clearly outlined in there and it was really beautiful in that way. So you don't have to recreate the wheel every time. And if something goes really well, go back and write that as an activity plan. It can be very helpful in organizing your thoughts. And if something didn't go quite right, it can help you organize on how you might want to recreate that. So that's all the things that go into an activity plan. And especially when we're talking about language and how we intentionally do that, thinking about how you presented it and the words that you used is very helpful, even in reflection.